Old Town woke beneath a sky the color of iron, and the gulls already circled the high tower, turning like flecks of ash in a wind that blew up from the whispering sound. The beacon on the high tower's crown had burned all night, and it guttered now in a wan glow, thin smoke smearing the morning as if some giant hand had tried to wipe the light away. Bells tolled from the starry September, a slow and reverberant calling that set the water shivering and sent the fishwives crossing themselves. The river men poled their barges through jeweled reflections of stained glass windows threading the water like serpents. The city smelled of salt and tar and fresh-baked bread, of river mud and the long, layered scents of stone worn by centuries of prayer. Samuel Tarley had not slept. He stood in a narrow room at the citadel with a window slit that looked toward the high tower's pale height. On the iron stand beside him, a dragonglass candle burned with a light that was not a light, the green-black shaft drinking the dawn and shedding a strange, cold luminance that seemed to pool without illuminating, as if the air itself were a pond and the candle rained into it. He had read about them first in dusty pages that smelled of mouse droppings and old beeswax, and he had thought them tales. Now one glowed before him. Marwyn had said it wanted his attention, not his faith. He rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands. Letters lay scattered like battered birds across the desk. The one from the wall had been smudged and folded so often the edges had furred. The one from John he kept beneath his breast, and had since the raven broke its quill tip against the sill like a dagger in the heart of wood. The words had been plain. The dead are marching. I need knowledge. Dragonglass and fire are not enough. Send what you can. Send hope. Sam had cried when he read that. He had never thought hope could be something you could parcel up and send, like bushels of barley. He had hoped all his life, but that was a private, timid hope, the sort that hid beneath beds with trembling knees. John's hope sounded like steel. It frightened him and warmed him, and made him remember the night under the weirwood when they had sworn their vows. And he had been brave because he had no choice and because John had looked at him and expected it. Behind him, the door whispered and old hinges sighed, and the room filled with the faint spiced smell of Marwyn's robes. You have it burning this early, the Archmaester said, as if remarking on a boy's first peach fuzz. His voice was rough with smoke and sand. A dozen chains lay upon his chest, metals dull and bright. Each link a disciplined Sam had only begun to understand. In the candle's sheen, the Valyrian glyphs tattooed across Marwyn's hands and forearms seemed to stir like eels in black water. It would not go dark, Sam said. I thought I had smothered it. I used the cap. It glows through. It listens. They do that, said Marwyn.
Sit, Samwell.
Sam did. He had grown used to his bulk in these rooms, used to guiding himself through the tight stacks of parchment and past the crowded shelves as if he were piloting a small ship in a labyrinthine canal. The chair creaked beneath him, the wood remembering a thinner man. He folded his hands together because when he left them loose they wrung one another raw. You asked to see me, Marwyn said, at night, about the letters.
Sam nodded.
Maester Eamon, told me to send word to Daenerys Targaryen, to the queen across the narrow sea. He spoke of a prince that was promised. He thought it might be her, or her child. He died before all of that. Now John says the dead are marching. John was dead too once. He swallowed. Then he was not. And the candle burns, and men from the north come to the docks with eyes as empty as broken eggs and tell tales that make the bravest men drink until they piss on themselves. I am sorry. Marwyn's eyes narrowed. Do not be sorry. Are you sure you are not merely a timid man trying to sound brave? I am sure, Sam said and surprised himself. I was timid. I still am sometimes. But something wants to be heard in the dark. And it's not just fear. The candle says the walls of the world are thin. Marwyn smiled in a way that was not kind and not unkind. His teeth were like small ivory coffins with the lids thrown back. Good. You know the words. You know Eamon's words of the dragon with 3 heads, the red star bleeding. You have read about the black stone under the high tower and the tales of the sorcerers of Azor. We quarreled about them, Ibros and I. He would put all of it into a pot and boil it until it formed a paste and then feed it to the pigs. But pigs are fed, and men are warned. I will not be here to see it. I am going east. Sam's heart skipped. East. Someone must greet the dragon, or tell her where to fly, or teach her to read the wind. These are not times for readers who never lift their eyes from the page. And someone must stand here and make a nuisance of himself among men who believe their skepticism a sword. He tapped the dragonglass candle with a knuckle, and the green shimmer quivered. To your John you will not send hope, Samuel. You will bring it.
Sam gaped.
To the north? To him. Or he will come south to the one place where the faith and the knowledge of the citadel and the power of the high tower, not into a snare you will either tighten around your own throat or use as a leash for a frightened realm. Marwyn's smile deepened. Old Town will be a forge before long. Fires are already lit. Ibroz will not allow. Ibroz will allow what the city forces him to allow, Marwyn said. Leighton Hightower has locked himself up in his tower with his daughter who counts comets. The most devout sit their benches and have learned to count coin better than sin. Whispers say that Euron Crow's eye is gathering ships in the Shield Islands like black gulls on a dead whale. The faith's bells are tolling because a lesser High Septon wants to be the greater one. And you, Samwell Tarly, are a man whose father taught him to fear everything but his father. Sam flinched as if struck. Yes, good. Fear is useful when you stop lapping at it. Marwyn glanced toward the window. A rower's chant rose from the river mouth, and with it the clunk of heavy wood, the murmuring rush of water around a hull. When Jon Snow writes that he needs hope, hear that he asks for what books do not hold. He asks for you, for truth, for witnesses. Witnesses. The faith will say he blasphemes when he speaks of prophecies that are not in their catechisms. The citadel will say he is mad. The lords will say he threatens their harvest. Witnesses break that kind of folly. Bring them. Better still, make them bring themselves. How? Old words in an old place, said Marwyn. A name that has been whispered in both monasteries and brothels by men who want to live to see their grandchildren. Azor Ahai. They will come to deny it, or affirm it, or condemn it. They will come because they, too, would like to purchase a piece of hope. Sam felt ill and exultant, a child who had been told to jump and found the ground had moved. He had thought he had left cruelty behind him at Horn Hill. Now all the weight of the South's civility pressed on his chest like a mailed hand. He could hear his father's voice. You are not made for this work, boy. You will end up fat and dead, and no one will remember your name. He thought of Gilly's eyes, and little Sam's fist curling around his thumb. He thought of Jon on the wall, the wind like fish knives biting their faces, and how Jon had looked at him as if he were more than a candle stuttering in a draft. He remembered the night he had stabbed an other with a shard of dragonglass and the way the ice had screamed as it cracked. He had not been made for that either. I will write to Jon, he said quietly. I will ask him to come. You will tell him to come, Marwyn corrected. Tell him to bring the blade he carries and the wounds that do not heal and the death that rides behind him. And tell him to come to the starry September. Let the seven hear him. Let the most devout wet themselves on the stones. Let the city's old bones listen. Outside, the bells tolled on, and the high tower's smoke thickened as if the beacon were considering a brighter burn. Jon came by water. He had wanted to come by road. He would have preferred a horse beneath him and a sky that belonged to the north, gray and bare and honest. But Davos had pointed at the maps with that battered finger of his and grunted about speed and spies and how many ways the Freys and the Lannisters and any number of hedgelords would find to put a knife between a man's shoulder blades when he rode alone and proud. A ship, Davos had said, and a quiet one, and come in among the pilings where no one watches for kings. I am not a king, Jon had said. I am too poor to bandy titles, Davos replied, squinting at him from under his brow like a gnarled old turtle. If folk are to bend their knee, best they do it to your work and not your cloak. You are something better than a king right enough. You will be if you live. They had come down the west coast, hugging the shore by night and slipping into little inlets by dusk where the reeds hissed around their hull. The air was different with each cove. In the north it had been a blade. In the reach, it became the quiet of the knife after it has cut. John had not told half the men where he was bound. He had not told Sansa, though he had told her enough. She had stared at him beneath the window where the frost made lace, and when he had finished speaking, she had lifted her hand and touched his breastbone with 2 fingers as if she were counting his ribs. "You leave me with ghosts and wolves," she had said. "Wolves are better than ghosts," he told her. It was a jest and not a jest. They had learned how easily a man became the other. Now the little cob of a ship nosed along the embankments where merchant hulks lay like fat geese. John stood near the fore, hood up, Longclaw wrapped in an old leather that smelled of oil and lanolin. He had thought he had left death at the wall. He had not. It came with him wherever he went now. It stood in the shadow of his shoulder and sometimes leaned to whisper in his ear. He had discovered that when the dead had kissed you on the mouth, they did not go so easily. Sometimes the world's colors thinned and music ached the way scars do in cold weather. "Old town," Davos said and spat over the side. "She looks like a lady who sleeps with her jewels on." "Is that bad?" John asked, because the talk helped, because Davos's voice sounded like wood burning on a cold night. "It's a thing to be careful of. I once knew a woman like that, and a man woke one morning with the pattern of her necklaces stamped on his cheek and no coin in his purse." Davos's mouth twitched. "But there's wisdom under all that silver, if you know where to knock." The high tower rose a little apart from the city like a finger that might once have been lifted in warning and had grown tired. The starry September domes were lower, faceted like gems cut for giants. John watched the stained glass glimmer and then darken as clouds moved across the sky. He thought of the gods of the south and how they wanted to be seen. He thought of the gods of the north, who listened without showing their faces. He wondered which had the better manners. They docked in the hush of a side quay. Davos had arranged it with a man whose name he did not say more than once. A boy had been sent running ahead. The ropes were thrown. John felt the thrum of the river through the boards as if the ship had a heartbeat. He did not move until Davos grunted and moved first. The crew were the sort of men who spoke little and looked at their feet. Suited John. He had learned that when you wanted to hide, the best thing was to see everyone and let no one see you. Sam met him in a narrow lane that smelled of fish scales and rosemary. He had grown thinner, or it might be that John had learned to see the man inside the flesh. He wore a novice's robe, plain, with belt and sleeves that bore faint stains from ink, sweat, and the oils that preserved old leather. His hair had thinned, too. He was still Sam. He stood with his hands knotted and his eyes shining, and when he saw John, he stepped forward and swallowed his apologies and embraced him. John heard the rattle in his breath and clapped him hard between the shoulders once, twice, not trusting himself to speak. "It's you," Sam said, and then sobbed the way a child does when someone tells him the worst is over. John held him until he got better. "It is me," John said. "It is and it isn't." Sam's eyes flicked to John's face, searching not for features but for something behind them, and John let him.
Sam nodded.
"Come," he said. "Come quickly. There's so much to show you and not enough time. There is never enough time. Davos, Ser Davos, hello, and please, please, both of you, be careful how you speak in the Citadel. Careful how we speak in a house of learning," Davos snorted. "There's a jest." Sam smiled without humor. "They have their own gods, and they are not the seven. They are the things they have always believed and will not be moved from. Pride mostly, and a fear of the unknown that they have disguised so long as prudence that they believe it is prudence. Beware the men who are cowardly in their souls and think it wisdom in their heads, John. They slipped through lanes where laundry hung like flags, and through arcades of pale stone where the shadows were cool and smelled of earth. The Citadel swallowed them with a great door whose iron studs were polished by generations of hands. John had been in many halls built for power. This one had a quieter supremacy. He felt the weight of what men had known pressing on his skull. They passed a stone courtyard where young men in black and brown pounded at anvils, their faces streaked with sweat, and the sound of hammer on link rang out like an oath. The air smelled of iron and meat. In a slit of space between shelves loaded with scrolls, A narrow man with a sharp tongue and hooded eyes moved away too quickly, his steps soft as needles, and Sam muttered under his breath, "Pate," though later he swore to John that he had not meant to say it. "A marriage record," Sam said in a stingy room where a single lamp made a globe of warmth amid the dark. He spread a small stack of parchments. A Septon's annals. His hand was clumsy. He made mistakes. He corrected them. He lists sums paid for wedding wine and candles, and he notes his indigestion and the goose he ate that made it worse. He is not interesting except when he is, and then he is mortal as we are. He pushed one sheet forward. He wrote this with the same hand with which he wrote about the goose. "I have handled the page for a week, John, and it has not turned back into goose." John read. The writing was as Sam had said. Thin, the ink blotted in places, a little slope, an uncertainty you would never find in the clerkly hands of the Red Keep. The words were not many. They said that a prince's marriage had been set aside and a new marriage had been performed in a wood before a heart tree because the gods of the man's mother and father were weary of waiting for him to choose. "Rieger," John whispered. His mouth was dry and the words stuck, fleshy and absurd. In it, Lyanna.
Some nodded.
"It is a name the South likes to weep over," he said. "They like to pretend the weeping is for justice, and sometimes it is. Sometimes it's only for spectacle. The writing is there. Parchment makes fools of storytellers. It cares not for how we rearrange our comforts." John sat down heavily. He had not known that his knees were joints for bending until they failed him. He stared at the words until they blurred and doubled and then resolved again, and he thought of Ned Stark and the way his father had stared at fire as if it might talk back to him one day. He had thought he knew what secrets cost. He had not. He understood now why a man might build a castle of silence and live in it so well you never suspected you were a guest until the day the doors closed behind you forever. "I do not want this," he said finally. "I know," Sam said. "That's one of the reasons you should have it." "What am I supposed to do with it?" John asked. "Ride to King's Landing and tell them they have been kneeling to a mistake? Put a crown on my head and pretend I do not see the dark climbing over the wall in my mind every time I close my eyes?" "No," Sam said, "but the South loves its forms. It loves to be told that the thing it fears is the thing it will be saved by, and that it can be anointed for the saving. Aegon the Conqueror came to Old Town once, and the High Septon anointed him in the Starry September, and the Faith told itself that it had given him his right to rule when every man knew he had taken it with a dragon. You have no dragons, but you have a right and you have need. Eamon told me that prophecy, when it is true, does not ask permission. It finds the mouth that can speak it." John's hands moved without his permission. He rubbed Longclaw's leather-wrapped hilt with his thumb where the wolf's head of its pommel peered from under the rag which hid it. He had always thought the sword was a promise. Now it felt like a hand that pressed his lower back, urging him through a door he did not want to pass, for all that the room beyond held warmth and bread and the faces of men he loved. "What would I claim?" he said, almost hoarsely. "A name? A throne? Prophecy? I was a bastard at the wall, and it broke and I broke with it, and death took me and then gave me back as if I were a trout too small for the pan." He shut his eyes. "What am I?" "Alive," Sam said, "and needed." He hesitated. "Marwyn says to be seen. He says the Faith needs to be forced to stand in a room and decide if it prefers its pride to its people. He says to go to the Starry September. He says the most devout are gathering, not all, but some, and the Hightower has sent invitations in every direction. And he says he has a way of saying things as if they fall from a height into your ear. He says that if there is any place south of the neck where the gods have been listening to anything but themselves, it's there." Davos shifted on his heels by the door like a man testing a floorboard to see whether it will bear any more weight. "What is it he means to have you say there?" he asked. Sam looked between them. "That winter is not the worst of it, and that prophecy is not a plaything, and that hope is a blade you do not get to unsheathe and then decide you never liked the edge of." John thought of Melisandre and her eyes like red coals buried beneath ash. He thought of her hands, delicate and firm, drawing shadows from fire like a midwife pulling a child from a woman. He did not know where she was now. He did know that he could not speak the words Azor Ahai without seeing the shape of a woman crying out while a sword slid into her breast. The stories were stories. He had learned that stories were often meat that had been rotted and then dressed with salt. But he could not help the shudder. He could say he did not want to be that man. He could say he would not be. Could words command fate? Azor Ahai, Davos said, rolling it in his mouth as if he were tasting a dubious stew. A prince that was promised. If you'll have my counsel without the salt, lad, I'd say call yourself what the folk can hear without it souring their stomachs. You call yourself the man who came to tell them the snow in their teeth ain't spindrift. It's death. You call yourself the sword in the duh. Rkness and the watcher on walls, because those words make sense even to men who never saw a keep. If some priest hangs a second name on you because it makes the bells ring, well, so be it. But don't be swallowed by it. That way lies madness. I have seen it in a king's eyes. I have seen what it costs. John looked up. Davos's face was a map of seas and storms and hollows where bones showed. He could not imagine the man as anything other than himself. Yet Davos was right. Men put on crowns and forgot the weight of their skulls beneath. I will go to the starry September, John said slowly. I will tell them what is coming. And if they need some name to make themselves brave, they can call me by it. But I will not do the thing that made the name matter. I will not put a sword in a lover's heart to light it. If the gods want such, let them find another fool. Sam nodded vigorously, tears rimming his eyes. Yes, that. Let's make them listen, John. Let's make them stand where the seven look down and refuse to hear, if they dare. The starry September held the past like a jar holds honey, and it glazed everything that came into it with a sweetness that could either cloy or heal. The floor was a mosaic of stars, the facets of their stones rubbed by generations of penitence until they gleamed like wet shells. The statues of the seven stood in a curve within the apse, their faces calm and terrible and very nearly human in a way that made John's skin itch. How did you carve stone to look as if it judged you for presuming to look at it? The great dome above was studded inside with silver stars like nails in a black barrel. Light from the stained glass fell in ribbons across gray columns. Incense smoked in braziers cunningly wrought like the heads of lions. The whole of Old Town seemed to have been poured in. There were fishermen in their Sunday coats and merchant wives with their hair folded into stacks you could have set cups upon, and knights whose spurs chimed like tiny bells. At the fore, on the bench the most devout used, sat men of gravity with rings on every finger, and near them, with his shoulders forward and his hands steepled, Lord Leighton Hightower watched through shadow, his daughter Malora beside him, her hair unbound and her eyes staring up at the dome as if she were reading a book there written in constellations. Sam had not entered by the main doors with John. There were small ways into old houses for men who knew them. He moved along the edges of the nave, robes sighing, a novice in the places novices were not supposed to be. He saw Pate again, or the man people called Pate now, and the hair on his neck rose, not because of danger but because something like the absent taste of a remembered food haunted him where that man stood. The man smiled. It was the smile of a key that knows it opens very many doors. Sam turned his face away and pressed his way forward. At the west end, an old Septon whose voice could reach the edges of the whispering gallery lifted his hand. The bells in the tower answered with a slow, solemn 3. Quieter than that was the sound of the city outside, the clop of a single horse on stone, the thin call of a girl selling pears, the soft thrum of the river. John stood at the edge of the crowd, the hood shadowing his features, Davos at his shoulder. When he lifted his head, he saw the warrior's statue with its sword raised and the crone with her lamp. He had drawn strength from lamps in the dark. He hoped to give a little now. You are gathered, the old Septon said. His voice had the color of old vellum, dry and smooth. The most devout are gathered. We are honored by Lord Leighton, whose house is a guard to our city. We are honored by the men of the citadel who come to sneer from their second souls, and by those who come to listen with their first. We are told there is a man who would speak doom to us and call it hope. Well, the seven do not hide when miserable news enters a room. They sit where they always sit and wait. Come then, doom. Bring your hope. Sam's heart hammered. Davos glanced sideways at John, who let his hood fall because there is no use trying to hide once a man has asked the wind its name. A murmur like dry leaves in a gust went up. Men craned their necks. A woman clapped her hand to her mouth. He was not a stranger. He was the North. He was Ned Stark's son. He was the bastard who had died and lived. He was winter's face in a room where men had practiced seeing only summer. "Jon Snow," the Septon said with a touch of satisfaction. "Lord Commander once, and yet here you are. Come." The aisle seemed longer than the length of the nave. Jon walked it and felt every eye like a finger on his sleeve. When he reached the front, he turned and saw what a great beast the gathering was, heaving and restless and easily angered and easily soothed. He wished for a moment that he had died and remained dead. Then he thought of the ice at Hardhome, and the way the silence afterward had felt like the bottom of the sea, and he spoke because not speaking was a sin. "You have heard tales," he said. He had decided not to move, not to pace like a huckster or wave his arms like a man drowning. He would stand like a tree and make them come to him with their eyes if they wanted more. "The dead have walked. They walk now. I could dress this in pretty words and tell you about legends perhaps your grandmothers told you to frighten you into eating your peas. I could say other and white and watch your mouths twist as if tasting a story. I will not. Truth deserves plain. The dead have walked. They hunt by cold. They will find your children in their beds. They will turn your wives to ice, your husbands to swords for their hands. They are coming, and the wall is not a wall any longer. The North will hold as long as we can, but we will not hold alone." They listened. The sound that 1,000 men and women make when they choose to listen is not silence. It is a leaning. "The faith knows of courage," Jon said. "The citadel knows of learning. The high tower knows of long watching. Use them. Send your food north now, not when you can spare it. Call your levies now, not when the wind bites your nostrils bloody. The harvest you hoard is a ghost's delight if you die with it in your cellars. The words you cluck in your halls will warm you like featherbeds when the snow sifts under your doors. And if there is a name that helps your hearts do the thing your heads should, then take it. Take mine." A draw of breath moved through the crowd. Jon could feel it brush his skin. "I have been told," he said, "that there are prophecies. Azor Ahai, the prince that was promised. Words from the east. Words that a maester I loved thought might be born in a dragon's house. I do not know if I am a prince. What is a prince? A father's pride? A title? I was a bastard. I am a man. I was born in a storm that no man remembers, and when I died the red fire dragged me back. Salt and smoke have wrapped themselves about me whether or not I wished it. If it pleases you to call me by a name, I will not spend the precious hours arguing syllables with you. Call me Azor Ahai if that lets you lift your feet and march. But I will do what must be done by my own choosing, and there will be no woman's heart pierced for my sword. I have had enough of lovers turned to graves." The old Septon watched him with an expression that Jon could not read until he realized it was terror carefully folded into dignity. "Blasphemies are prettier in the north than in the south," the Septon said, and his mouth twitched. "If this is blasphemy, it sounds to me like a man offering to be beaten in our stead. That is a blasphemy the seven know. We have carved him and put him above altars wherever you can find stone in this city. The Red God," a man called out, high and disdainful. He wore a chain on his chest. Ibros had cheeks like small stale buns and eyes that made Sam want to bow and beg forgiveness for having taken up space in rooms Ibros favored. "We will not have foreign flames lit here. This is not Volantis. Old Town has seen 100 prophets on our steps. We wash their piss from the stones the next day. Wash the blood then when the day after that comes," Marwyn said from a darkness Sam had not seen him occupy until now. Men flinched. Marwyn did not. "Looking at a candle does not set your beard alight, Ibros. Men burn because other men light the match," Ibros said. "Eamon dreamed of dragons all his life and lived to see none. The world is not obliged to your fantasies." Marwyn smiled. "Nor yours. As it happens, Eamon lived to see one in his last visions. but he refused to mistake a lantern for the dawn. He taught a boy that distinction. He taught this one. He lifted his chin toward Sam, and Sam felt suddenly as if he had been stripped. He saw his father's face and thought how small his father would look standing in this sea of folk, with the 7 staring down and stones all around him older than the command he thought he had on other men's bones. The knowledge did not make Sam proud. It made him steady. It pleases me to hear a man from the north insist upon refusing a murder dressed up as a god's command, a woman said. Melora's voice filled the space between echo and breath. She did not look at John as men look at men. She looked at him as if he were a bright mark in a ledger, valuable, but only if properly used. It also pleases me less to see the most devout flinch at a name. Names have a way of happening whether you like them or not. Better to pin the butterfly to the page than let it flutter into your mouth. Lord Leighton's hand curled on his knee where it lay. He looked older up close than he did from the shadow. There were hollows beneath his cheekbones and a bleakness in his pupils that made Sam think of a man who had looked into a well and watched an old friend drown there. But he cleared his throat and stood and bowed, slightly, to the 7 statues, which, being stone, accepted as stone accepts. Old Town has owed the realm too much to be thought clever when it hides behind her own porches, he said. We will send grain. We will send men. We will send ships to carry the grain and bring men home if we have homes for them to come to. And we will, if the 7 will be gentle with us in our pride, ask for a sign in this room where our forefathers asked for signs. Sam was not aware of having moved. He found himself near the front, near the pillars carved with chevrons that the mason had made into a pattern that looked like woven ropes. He had the dragonglass dagger in his sleeve, though he hated it and loved it both. Davos's hand was on Longclaw's wrappings that hid the wolf that had, at first, betrayed John's presence and then made men less bold in their mockery. John stood with his hands loose at his sides. He looked like Ned Stark in that moment, as if he had been carved by a winter wind. Sam understood then why people did not stop asking him to be things he did not wish to be. He made their longing seem as simple as breathing. A sign, then, the old Septon said. He did not sound as if he expected one. He sounded as if he had just asked a man to jump from the starry September's highest gallery to prove that the gods held his hand and was already composing a lament for the poor fool who would do it. What sign? The sign men have always demanded, Lord Leighton said softly. Fire that is not a trick. Light that you cannot snuff. A sword the dark cannot drink. Ah, said Ambrose almost gently. We are to conjure, then. If you want miracles, go to Ahai, Marwyn said. If you want truth, look out the door. The door had quietly become the loudest thing in the room. The murmuring rose like bees that have been shaken. Sam felt the cold before he heard anything new. The September stones sighed. The incense faltered. The light that fell through the blue panes of the mother's window turned thin, and then thin again, until it felt like threads being pulled, and Sam would have sworn he could hear them snapping, little brittle whispers in the great hush. Then the bells in the tower told once of their own accord, a single note, as if a hand had brushed them, testing their weight. A man pushed through at the back. Blood had dried on his jaw like a second beard. He staggered. His eyes were whites rimmed with pink. He held himself tight around the ribs as if to keep something from spilling out. He took 2 steps and then fell to his knees with his mouth open, catching for breath that would not come. The space around him widened. The city knew a plague when it saw one, and panic was a clever animal. It is the harbor, he coughed. Ships, black sails, war horns. His whole body clenched. Men nailed to the prows. Their mouths. He began to weep. They blew a horn and the water burned. You're on? Sam thought, and then closed his eyes because thinking the name was like leaning over the side of a high cliff at night with someone's hands on your back. The bells tolled again. Not a single cautious note now, but in earnest. Outside, the day darkened as smoke rose from the mouth of Old Town like breath in winter. The high tower's beacon leapt, and where it had been a steady flame it became, for a moment, a thing alive and furious, throwing out a low growl that no man could hear and every man felt in his stomach. Men shouted. Women screamed. The most devout turned their heads like crows startled on a roof. The old Septon had a hand pressed to his chest and his mouth working. The statues looked down with the same expressions, patient and terrible, as if this sort of thing happened every third day. John had not moved. Davos had. He was at the edge of the aisle, speaking in a quick low hiss to three men who had the look of soldiers and not the livery of any house present. And they went running, faces set. Up in the shadows, Melora's head tilted. Lord Leighton closed his eyes. Marwyn chuckled, perhaps involuntarily. "Salt and smoke," he said, and did not sound pleased. "Bring water," the old Septon cried. His voice splintered. "Buckets to the harbor as you can." "Sir." "My lord." "Hightower, man the keys." He was swallowed in talk. The September, that great beast, had been roused and everyone wanted to be its legs or its teeth or its tail. Sam felt the old fear climbing his spine. He remembered his father's hand on the back of his neck, pushing his head down so he could not see the boar they were about to hunt. He remembered the weight of armor and the sweat it trapped. He remembered how cool the day had been when he had held Dragonglass and how hot the others screamed. It was smoke that came first into the September, curling through the slats of the doors and under them, a creeping thing that stroked ankles and then knee joints. With it, the smell changed. Incense could not disguise pitch. John looked up at the dome. The stars set there seemed to flicker. "A sign," Ibros said dryly, and then, perhaps because some quieter note in him had not been killed by his cleverness, he flushed and looked down. John stepped forward. He was a man who knew cold and flame, who had died and refused to remain dead, who had stood under a sky that vomited snow as if it were sea foam and told other men to go where their fear did not want them to go. He touched Longclaw's wrapping. He untied the knot with fingers that felt rope and not prophecy. The sword sang when it came free of its sheath. It did not sing like gallant tales. It sang like an axe-cutting frozen wood. Its steel was valley light reflected in ice. "Do not do something foolish to please them," Davos said in a voice that sounded as if it began in his boots. "Sometimes," John said, "the only way to show a man his fear is to be foolish in front of him and live." He stepped past the braziers. He stood in the exact center of the September, on the ivory star set at the heart of the mosaic. The light from the Hightower's blaze found him in that place even as the smoke from the burning keys spread. The stained glass made bands of red and green and blue across his face so that for a heartbeat he looked like a stained thing himself, a warrior in a tale where men are melted into saints by story. "Azor Ahai!" cried a voice near the doors, shrill and thrumming. A woman had pushed through, tall, with hair like a spill of old blood, a ruby at her throat that caught the light the way a shark catches water. Melisandre. Sam had not known he was capable of feeling so many kinds of dread at once. She did not look at him or at any of them. Her eyes were widened until the whites showed all around her irises, and she seemed to be seeing something beyond them. "Azor Ahai," she whispered, "born amidst salt and smoke. See how the star bleeds." Sam looked involuntarily up. The Hightower's beacon flamed, and for a heartbeat a gout of some burned contaminant, pitch or oil or some alchemist's trick in the crow's eyes employ, leapt and split, and the lens that magnified it caught a fleck and made it run across the black of the clouds like a wound being opened. Red light fell through the crone's stained panes and laid a blade of crimson along the floor, a streak that ran like a road to John's feet. "Call it a sign if you like," Marwyn murmured, "or call it an opportunity." John did not speak any words to the seven. He was a Stark, or had been, and he knew the taste of words that you did not say with your mouth but with your bones. He put Longclaw into the brazier. The coals flared, and then went dark as if in shock, and then flared again. A hiss rose like an old woman's curse. He held the blade there until the leather of the hilt began to smoke and the wolf's head pommel grew warm beneath his palm, and then he lifted it high. The September drew its breath. Sam saw the faces of the poor and the prideful tilt up like flowers toward the sun. Nothing happened, only there was a thinness in the air around John as if heat were being drawn from it. The smoke blew sideways toward him and then upward and then dissolved in a series of small, startled eddies. The blade held a sheen that was not flame and not light.
Sam squinted.
His eyes watered. He thought of winter night when snow is so fine it hangs like dust and the moonlight catches it at an angle and the world glows not bright, but inevitable. Lightbringer, Melisandre breathed, and it sounded like a woman praying over a child's cradle. No, Jon said quietly, and his voice carried. Only a sword. He drove it down, not into a woman's breast, not into any living thing, but into the exact center of the star under his feet. The marble cracked with a sound like ice splitting on a river. The crack was not random. It ran in 7 ways, a star within the star, lines reaching for each of the 7 statues, stopping at their pedestals as if arrested by politeness. A second sound came with the crack, lower and older, as if something beneath the September had woken and turned in its sleep. The light that came from the blade was not bright. It was cold. It did not glare into men's eyes. It showed them the edges of things. It showed them the delicate seam between fear and folly. In its pallor, the dirty hem of a most devout's robe showed its grime. The rose spider building a web in a high corner became visible to men who would never look that high again. The old Septon's face, which had been grim and then astonished, softened. He began to laugh, not like a man who has heard a good jest, but like one who has just chewed bread long enough to realize it was honey. "You will not get your burning sword," Jon told them. "You will not get your woman's death. I am not your story." "Then be your own," Lord Leighton said. His voice was roughened by smoke and age and a kind of long-held contempt for men who had never had to. "Lean into stiff wind. It will serve. It will serve." "Azor Ahai," Melisandre said, and sank to her knees with her hands lifted. Sam thought for an instant a gleam of contempt moved beneath Jon's skin like a shadow of a fish beneath ice. Then it was gone. He had no time for contempt. The bells were calling and the wind that had slipped under the doors brought with it the sound of men dying. Davos put a hand on Jon's arm. "If they want you a god, let them pray while you do the work of men," he said. "The harbor." "Go," Jon said to the Hightower men. To Davos, he said, "With me." To Sam, "Stay and make them send grain." He hesitated. His hand brushed the hilt of Longclaw where the scent of scorched leather rose. "If anyone asks you to give them a miracle, tell them this. The miracle is that men are brave." They went into smoke. The September behind them became its name. A star, a point at which 7 roads met, a place of light you referenced even when you were not within it. Sam stood where the broken lines ran to the pedestals, and the old Septon stood with him, and Ambrose moved slowly toward the floor as if to examine the crack and not simply to have something to do with his hands. Outside, the harbor was a jaw with black teeth. Euron Greyjoy's ships were like bad dreams. Too high, too dark, sails like raven's wings stacked along the piers. They had the look of something that had laughed at a storm and then taught other ships to weep. Men screamed in the water. Burning oil made a red slick upon the soughing tide. The war horn that had been sounded lay against the sky like a wound being cut afresh each time it blew. Davos did not look at it. He looked at the places a man could do anything about. Jon felt the city's fear, that great beast again, this time stretching and baring its yellowed teeth. "Shields," Davos called. "Buckets. Hooks. You men." He seized one by the sleeve with the casual authority of a father in a kitchen. "Don't stand gaping. If you've hands that can haul rope, you can haul men from the drink. Get to it." The shore was chaos. Hightower men formed up by habit. Leighton's third son, who had bright eyes and the kind of smile men loved to die for in tournaments, rode at their head with a look on his mouth that suggested he had only just realized this was not a tourney. Jon waded into the edges of the fire where the heat was hammer blows. Longclaw's pale sheen did what Valyrian steel did to all that was not its equal. It made it smaller. He did not fight monsters out of icy tales. He fought men. He fought the men who had nailed ministers of their gods to the prows of their ships and arrayed them in mockery and set them afire to watch their faces learn a final prayer. He fought men whose eyes were wild with the delight of being terrible. He fought them with an economy of motion that bore testament to years spent in the company of men who counted strokes. And he fought them with a fury that was not hot, but precise, the anger of a surgeon at a knife left on a dirty tray. The horn sounded again, closer. A shape loomed through smoke. A ship with one great eye painted upon her prow and a figurehead that had once been a woman and now was a thing men had carved as if they were drunk on sacrilege. The vessel nosed forward as if sniffing. John saw men in rags lashed to the rails, mouths shriveled to horrid oaths. The horn blew again. It blew through them and they quivered like chimes. "The silence," Davos breathed. A laughing shape stood on the forecastle, black irons beneath his left eye and a cloak made of salt-stiff feathers that shifted when he turned. He held a sword that had drowned and been hammered back out of the deep. He lifted it in greeting toward the men on the quay, and perhaps toward John, though it was hard to tell. The crows I had the trick of making every man believe he was being looked at and none certain of it. "Bring me your priests," Euron called, his voice as merry as a man calling down to his friends with a cask and bread. "I have others for you to trade. I have drowned men with lungs full of light. I have a horn that speaks the language of beasts in the sky. Do you?" He laughed and spread his hands and let his ship burn a smaller craft beneath her length as she slid to berth. "No? Then sing me a song that makes me want to keep your city." Arrows fell. The Hightower's men loosed in disciplined volleys. Euron's men raised shields in black ripples and answered with flaming quarrels that stuck in the quay and burned like nettles that could not be pulled. John pushed forward. He thought of the starry September's crack and the 7 spokes of white that ran toward Old Stone. He thought of the prophecy Melisandre had clutched like a drunk holds a story that gives meaning to his too many nights. He thought of the cold that walked at the top of the world. He had no time for madness at the bottom of it. He met Euron's men where they leapt to stone. "The crow's eye did not come down." He watched. He watched the way an artist watches apprentices, hungry and bored at once, as if at any moment he might tear the brush from their hands and finish the thing himself out of disgust. He laughed sometimes when men died. He laughed when one of his own slipped and choked in burning oil. It was a laugh John had heard from boys who had been slowly taught that the only way to escape their father's contempt was to become it and make others live beneath its weight. "Behind you!" Davos barked, and John turned and cut a man who was not there because Davos had shouted not to be right but to make him move. And the arrow that would have buried in his lung took fire instead and spun into the water. They fought that way, back to back sometimes and then apart, and there was something like exquisite pleasure in it, in the fact that both of them had not died yet and did not intend to. A voice like a sobbing bell split the clamor. The war horn. Men had stories about horns that woke dragons. This was not that horn. This one sounded like a throat cut in a stable, and when it blew the water bucked and rolled where it should have run smooth. The harbor's surface went to scales and then did not. Men cried out. Men always cry out when the world breaks even a little. "Grapnels!" Davos shouted. "Bring her in. Bring her in or we'll be at this for days and they'll burn us from the back." Black ropes snaked out. Hooks bit wood. The silence did not shy. She came like a woman who had decided to do a bloody thing and was not going to be deterred by the fact that her dress would be ruined. Euron drew an arm across his face to block the heat and grinned into the firelight, his teeth luminous. "Come then," John said softly, though the man could not hear him. He climbed the ropes hand over hand like a boy at Winterfell, his arms and shoulders obedient, his lungs burning. He hit the rail hard, rolled, rose, took a step, and a man came like a mace out of the smoke. He had a tattoo of a ship taking a wave and his eyes were milky, as if some disease had chewed them and left them only the outlines. John cut him by reflex, and then another, and then he was at the forecastle and Euron was there. A lightness to him that was not grace but the kind of careless bodily knowledge men acquired when they had driven their flesh past shame so often it had become an obedient dog. "Stark," Euron said in a voice that sounded amused that the world had produced a man and called him by that old winter name. "No, not a Stark. Something else. You have been somewhere I have not. I can smell it on you. Stay back." John said to two of Euron's men who were creeping along to flank him. The sword could not be in two places at once. He felt the decks under his feet and knew too many men had died upon them for the wood not to remember. Euron's sword drank the light. It made a hollow around it. He raised it lazily. "You mean to fight me in my own house," he said. "I like your arrogance. I mean to kill you because you nailed men to your prow like decorations," John said. "It will not help the war I came to speak of, but I will sleep better for it." Euron had one of those faces that collapses into itself when it laughs. John had a sudden urge to bring Longclaw down and cut that laugh off, not because of the war or because of the nailed men, though he despised that, but because of the simple annoyance of a man who believes he will outtalk a blade. He did not get to try. The ship bucked. Chains went singing. One of the Hightower's smaller boats had rammed the Silence's stern in a maneuver too sensible to try again. Men tumbled. Euron stumbled and caught himself and leapt down the steps with a quickness that made the air feel thin. He thrust, and John parried, and their swords ran along one another like water. There was a moment then, a moment out of time, when both men were balanced on their heels with their blades crossed and their breathing loud and synchronized, and they saw one another's eyes, flat ocean blue, black as a winter pool, and understood that they would not finish this today, that the gods had not given them to one another yet, that they did not get to write the ending here because the page was crowded with other hands. "Soon," Euron whispered. He sprang back and gave a short, impatient gesture. His men obeyed, slackening ropes, unhooking grapnels with brutish swiftness. The Silence slid away with the water sucking after her like a man who cannot accept that a woman has left the room. Euron bowed once, as if to a partner he expects to dance with again. The horn sounded laughingly rude. The ship turned, black against smoke, and was gone. John stood there, the deck beneath him hot through his boots. The rail burned where tar had run. Men lay scattered like cracked amphorae. A Hightower boy scrabbled at a knot and could not loose it and wept because his fingers would not yet obey him. Davos was standing on the quay looking up and swearing with cheerful vigor at Jon's retreating line of decision. They had not won. They had not lost. They had learned that madness loved pageantry. It would come again. Jon slid down, dropped to the quay, met Davos's glare and grinned despite himself, because he was breathing and the air was hot and vile and his heart was a hammer and his arm felt as if someone had poured molten lead into it, and that meant he was not dead. Davos thumped his arm. "If you are going to keep taking years from me, lad," he said, "I shall send you the bill." "Send it to Winterfell," Jon said. They went back to the starry September with their clothes stinking of pitch and their faces blackened, and the crowd made a noise that did not know if it was joy or terror, and in that moment became something like worship, because men love to sing when they have nearly died. Inside, the cool did not cool them. The crack in the floor remained, and the light at the blade's tip where it had bitten stone was paler now, fading. Men were gathered around the most devout, speaking at them, not to them. The old Septon stood and his body trembled, but his voice no longer did. "We will anoint you," he said to Jon, without preamble and without the habit of asking. "We will explain ourselves to the Seven as we always have for politics dressed as piety. We will tell the city that we have done what men always do in fear, that we have put a name on the man we demand save us so that we may have a word to curse if he fails. We will make the blessing. We will place oil on your brow and mutter the old words. It will mean nothing and it will mean everything." "I want grain," Jon said. "You will have it." "I want the bells rung not for mass but for muster," Jon said. "You will have that too," said Lord Leighton. "And men who know how to use ropes and water. I will write. Old Town is not only books. I want the Citadel to find the truth in their own words and send them north on the wings of ravens," Jon said. "Dragonglass veins, old maps of the first men. Any line of ink a man thought perhaps did not matter." Marwyn snorted. Ibros bowed the tiniest of bows, and there was a sneer hidden in it, and under the sneer a thoughtfulness that surprised Sam. "We will send what we have," he said. "We will send what we thought we did not need. The dead do not care if we are embarrassed to have been wrong." Jon felt suddenly very tired. He saw the crack in the floor and thought that had he plunged his sword into a woman's breast instead, maybe he would have gotten a sword that burned prettily. He had gotten a floor that resembled a star's echo instead. Good. He could not trust a god that demanded that kind of proof. He could perhaps trust a man who knew how to read a cracked stone. Sam stood with Gilly in the side aisle. He had meant to send her away. He had meant to send her to Mrs. Plum at the baker's and leave her there with flour in her hair and the baby in a cradle beside the oven where the heat was benign. She had come to the September instead, because Gilly had learned long ago that men always tried to put women into cellars when they meant to do something brave, and she was not made for cellars. Little Sam slept where the noise was greatest. The sound of large men being solemn always put babies to sleep. John bowed his head when the old Septon lifted the vial. The oil smelled of olives and some herb that grew in Old Town's kitchen gardens, and of smoke because the city had burned and everything smelled of smoke. "By Father's justice," said the old Septon, dabbing John's brow. "By Mother's mercy." Another touch. "By warrior's courage." His hand shook here and steadied. "By maiden's hope." His eyes softened and he glanced involuntarily toward the women clustered like a bank of flowers in the nave. "By Smith's labor." The scent of iron rose from the oil. "By Crone's wisdom." He smiled helplessly at the lamplight that made his hand glow. "And by the stranger's truth." He put his thumb in the oil and pressed it straight into the center of John's forehead, a mark that would rub off in an hour. "Be what we are not and cannot be even when we say we will." "I will be only what I can," John said, and the oil had a warmth through his skull, as if it were remembering something that had happened to him on a cold table, a breath ago and a lifetime ago. He did not shudder. If men saw a shudder now, they would tell one another the man they wanted was gone, and only a trembling boy remained. He had done with letting other men's desires write the words they wanted to see on his face. They placed a cloak on his shoulders. He shrugged it off. He was not theirs to dress. He would dress in furs and mail and whatever the North required. Ibrose lifted his head as if to remark and then did not. The crone's light fell on him, and in it his disdain seemed very small. "They will be here," Davos said at his shoulder, "before the week is out. The ships that did not burn will follow the river up with grain. The high towers will throw their weight. The citadel will send ravens until the sky darkens with them. And the dead," John said softly. Davos's hand found his forearm and squeezed. "Aye," he said. They left Old Town the next day. Not because John wanted to be anywhere other than in rooms where occasionally men believed what he told them, but because time was a wolf on the hill, not a civil hound in a garden. Melora Hightower gave them charts and pointed at them with a long finger and told them where old currents had run during old winters and where Englishmen. That was some odd word she used briefly and then discarded with a shake of her head, a sign that some girl in some tower somewhere had taught herself a language she had no use for, where men did not know the names of had gone in past centuries. "Water remembers better than men," she said. "Follow it." "Follow you," Davos said gruffly and bowed. And the look she gave him suggested she had not met so practical a compliment in all her years. Sam did not go. He stayed. It was the hardest thing he had done since he had stood shaking before his father. He had Gilly and little Sam. He had the candle that liked to burn near his thinking and the shelves upon shelves of men's thoughts wrapped in leather, and Ibro's sour face, and Marwyn's absence like a hand withdrawn. He had work. He had the strange peace of it and the terror of it, and he watched John go as he had watched him go once before into snow, and he did not beg him to stay because he had learned that love was not a cage. He watched Davos go because Davos would always go, and it comforted him to know that. He watched the river bear them away until they were smaller than gulls, and then not gulls at all. Gilly touched his arm. "Will the bad men come again?" she asked. "Yes," Sam said. He did not lie to her because she did not accept lies when she had looked at a man's throat while he bled. "And the dead, and our own foolishness, and our own courage. What shall we do when they do? We shall cool the fire we can and send messages to men who can carry the water where we cannot. We shall make sure no one starves because we could not do somes. We shall be brave in the manner of little things, and leave the big things to the men who have swords that are not named for burning. You will write to John," she said. "You will send him words on little pieces of birch and vellum, and he will hold them in his hands, and his hands will be less empty. Yes, he said, and pressed his palm to hers, and the warmth there sustained him more than all the knowledge in the citadel. In Old Town's markets, long after John had gone, men told a story about a day when the Sept stones had cracked like ice in thaw, and light had come up from the floor like a ghost learning to dance. They embellished it because men cannot help themselves. In some tellings, the sword had burned with fire and nothing else, and a woman had screamed and died, and that, they said, is what made a god of a man. In others, John had refused all crowns and entered the deep with stones in his pockets, and the sea had thrown him up, and he had not taken a breath. In the truest telling, he had stood and told them that he would rather be called a name he did not like than see their children starve, because their fathers had been too proud to be foolish in front of a crowd. The city had burned and then not. The high tower's beacon was tended with a new meticulousness that was almost tenderness. The bells of the starry September tolled for men who went north as they had once tolled for men who went to court. The citadel's ravens flew like beads broken from a string. The poor ate from bowls set out by the faith without anyone counting how many times they filled them. Euron lay like an oil slick on the sea and slid away when men came with hooks and ropes and then returned and returned, laughter on his breath and salt in his hair. Malora Hightower counted the nights between his visits against the nights between certain stars and wrote a thing no one saw. John crossed the Mander and the Green Fork and the roads that bound the reach like cloth and went north. Sometimes at night, under a sky like hammered iron, he raised Longclaw and looked not at flame but at edges and told himself where the world ended and where he began. He thought of the starry September and the cracked stone and the oil on his brow and the word the old Septon had left there that had not rubbed away as entirely as he had supposed. He thought of prophecy like a cloak you only wear in the rain. You do not sleep in it and you do not dress children in it for games. He thought of the dead and of one man with blue eyes who had looked at him once as if he were a puzzle easy to solve. At a wayhouse near the Blue Fork, he dreamed sitting up with his back to the wall and his sword laid across his knees, the way men do who cannot leap because sleep comes too close to a door that will not let them out. In the dream, the starry September was not a building but a sky. 7 spokes of pale light ran through it. He stood at the center again and had the sense that if he took a step forward, everything would fall. He did not. He woke with his hand around the grip and Davos snored like a small bear with a cold, and the fire was down to coals and the wind made the shutters kicker. "What is it?" Davos said at once, not because he had a gift for hearing a man's dreams but because he had, over years, learned that men were their own worst enemies in the hours just before dawn. "Nothing," John said. "Only the city back there." He lifted a shoulder. "They said a lot of words." "They did," Davos said. "And you said the right ones. We're not called to make sense of gods, lad. We're called to keep men from drowning in shallow water. If the gods wish to bless our fool's labor, well, let them. I've known a ton of gods to go about with their thumbs in their mouths. The men with buckets are the ones I remember." John laughed then, came easier than he would have believed. He thought it might be because the oil on his brow had warmed his skin in a way that reminded him of men laying hands on other men's heads because the world drove them nearer one another than was comfortable. He had not liked it. He liked the way it made him remember old gentlenesses he had thought he lost. They caught the first snow near the Trident, came down in gusts, rough as wool, then fine like flour falling out of a broken bag. John lifted his face into it. He thought of the starry September where the mother's window made blue each morning until the sun was higher and then the panes became but colored glass again, with no miracle in them at all. He thought of Melisandre's eyes fixed on a thing that might not exist and the way she had looked surprised when a sword had not burst into flame at Jon's will. He felt pity for her, which surprised him. He had thought himself done with pity. He was not. A rider brought word from the neck. It was grim. Men who never left their swamps were leaving them. A man with a Cranach's patience had tied to the rider's saddle a pouch with a sprig of some green thing in it and a strip of leather notched with a reed-cut knife. John took it. He read the notches as if he had always known how. "You are what I thought you were," the notches said. It made him laugh and then it made him almost weep. At the wall's shadow, where the air had teeth again and the sky pressed down, They found men riding on the packs of mules with chalk and totting up days and barley sacks and arrows so carefully that Davos stood with his head tilted and his eyes soft with respect. "This is the work," Davos said. "This is the work, and any man who tells you otherwise is mad or wants you to be." From the east came a wind that did not remember seas. From the west came a smell of rot dredged from old river bottoms where fish bones lay among the rib cages of kings. The dead came with that smell, and Jon raised his sword on a night when the moon was a clipped coin and the light it offered exacted very high rates of interest on men's courage. He opened his mouth, and what came out was nothing like Azor Ahai and everything like the words men keep in the threads of their cuffs because they will need them in a minute and they don't know it yet. He said, "Hold," and men held. He said, "Now," and men moved, and in that he was what prophecy meant when prophecy was being kind. The starry September stood in Old Town, and the crack in its floor endured, and men stepped across it without thinking and sometimes thought of it when they were alone, and they wondered if they had been in a holy place that day or only a great stone room where a man had been brave and the light had done a usual thing at the unusual moment. And they prayed anyway because praying is also a usual thing, and sometimes it opens small doors. In the South, where winter comes with a prettier dress and better manners, the bells tolled sometimes not for weddings or funerals but for the departures of carts loaded with sacks of grain. And the men who loaded them had their names read out as if they were knights, and sometimes, later, they were. Marwyn found a dragon, or a dragon found him. That was a story for another time, and he would never tell it right because he loved to make men mad. Ibrose read a line in a book about Flint and decided to send it north because it made him uncomfortable to think he might have read it and not remembered. Malora wrote under starlight and burned certain pages as soon as she dried the ink. The old Septon lay awake in his narrow bed and held his ribs and thought how once, long ago, he had laughed at a man who had looked at a boy and loved him without deserving it, and how that love had been a better prayer than any the old man had said since. He wept then, because time had taught him the fragility of what men thought were firm things. Euron came and went like weather, and twice he almost set the city to a new kind of music. Screams threaded on a line until you could wear them. Lord Leighton's son, the one with the bright smile, died with his teeth bared and his eyes wide like a man trying to see the end of his own story. Leighton sat with his hands open for a long time and then closed them carefully and went to ring the bells himself. In all of this, the starry September was a promise kept. A place men went to if they wanted to speak in the presence of something they did not think was themselves. In the far north, on a clear day so cold a man's spit would freeze before it hit his boot, Jon knelt in a shallow drift and held Longclaw point down. The pale light at the steel's edges trembled and then steadied because the light had learned now what it was supposed to be in his hand. Around him, men shivered and told themselves that they were not afraid. He could see their lies rising like smoke from their mouths. He loved them for lying well. He loved them for telling the truth with their knees and their backs and their shoulders. He closed his eyes. In him, the starry September's hum lay like a strip of hammered silver he had tucked inside his shirt. He thought not to the seven, not to the red god, not even to the old ones who listened in leaves, but to the thing greater than gods which makes them gods if they exist at all. He thought to the part of men that is not hungry or proud or petty or cruel, the part that puts a hand on another man's back in smoke and says, "There," and the man lives because of it. He thought, "Give me enough time to make the little miracles. Let the big ones go to the birds." He rose. The first rank of the dead came at a trot, noiseless, snow not troubling them with squeaks as it did men. He moved. He became simple. He became exactly what he was. He had been anointed at the starry September and dressed in oil that smelled of olives and smoke and the leather of the old Septon's hand. He had been called a name he did not keep in his mouth. He had held a blade in a fire and driven it into stone and broken neither. He had said no to a story's cost. He would continue to say it. He did not need to say it aloud now. His body said it for him. Somewhere very far away, in a city at the edge of the sea, a woman placed her hand on the cracked star in the floor of a September and felt under her palm the faintest murmur, like a memory. She lifted her hand to her mouth and laughed and felt shame for having laughed and laughed again, and then went to boil barley for men who hauled ropes because that was the miracle the day asked of her. Somewhere nearer, in a camp where his breath turned to white ghosts, a man who had never believed in anything but the gods of money and the dark decided to stand with his neighbors when the cold shapes came. And when asked later why, he said, "There was a story. I heard it. A man did a thing and I thought I could do a smaller thing. It helps to hear of the big thing. It helps and I don't know why." Men talked about Azor Ahai and argued about who he had been and who he might be. Men will argue about such things until they die and then argue no more. When John's name stood next to the prophecy's words, sometimes the old Septon would clear his throat and say, in a voice still paper dry and surprisingly certain, he did not claim the name. He used it as a tool. That is a better claim. It means he was not pleased by it. You can trust a man more when he is not pleased by the taste of his crown. And when men asked Sam, as sometimes they did because they had heard he knew, was his sword aflame? Did he cut darkness open and spill light from it? Sam would smile because he loved men for loving the wrong things and loving them well. It was a good sword, he would say. He held it as if it were a promise he would keep even if it hurt him. Sometimes it made edges clear. That is enough. Winter came full. It laid its hand on the South gentler, but the South learned that gentleness could kill as well as cruelty. The North did not pretend. Men died. Men lived. Some miracles were rightable. Others were not. In the spring that would follow a killing cold, it would be said that Old Town had kept its lamps lit better than most, and that men had eaten and that boats had slid up the rivers with sacks easy to count, and that names were carved into lintels to remember the men who had loaded them. A child would run her fingers over one and read it aloud, and the old Septon would close his eyes, and in a dream he would be again in the great nave, and the stars above would blink, and he would laugh like a man who has found honey in an old jar he had thought was empty. John did not come back to Old Town that year. There were roads he had to take that did not bend that way. But sometimes, in camp, he would touch his brow unconsciously where the oil had once been and feel its ghost warmth and think of the seven, not as gods but as statues looking down at men who had decided to be gods to one another for the hour they needed it. He thought of the crack in the floor. He felt in the bones of his wrist the artisanal thrum of it when his sword had struck. He remembered the way the light had not blazed but clarified, and he let that be his sword's only enchantment. It was enough. When he thought of Azor Ahai, he did not think of himself. He thought of a room where men had put down their quarrels for half a day and listened because smoke had been in their noses and the sound of their city crying had made them careful with one another. If prophecy had a heart, he thought it would be that. Not the flame, not the crown, not the triumph, but the hour when men look at one another and decide to share a name so they can be less enemies and more neighbors. The seven looked down. The old gods watched through leaves somewhere snow-laden and patient. The red god, if he existed, warmed his hands at fires men had made for one another and smiled smugly. The stranger went on with his work and made no speeches. John lifted Longclaw when he had to and set it down when he could. He kept his promises in smoke and in frost. Somewhere, in the cracks of white marble far to the south, wheat grew in a thin line the width of a hand where wind had blown seeds and they had lodged. Sam saw it one morning when he was sweeping and gasped and then laughed and bent to touch it and whispered, "There," as if he were toasting bread at a hearth. The horn sounds came less often at the harbor. Euron had other games. He was drawn to the bright places where men made stories about themselves. Old Town went on with the quieter ones.
Bells rang.
Bread baked. Water was hauled. In the starry September, men laid hands on other men's heads and pressed oil into their skin and asked them to be what they were not, and those men nodded and went and did a smaller thing. Stood a watch, hauled a net, wrote a letter. They could finish before dark. It was prayer enough. And if, sometimes, in the last light of day, a pale sheen ran along the chisel marks of the cracked star, as if a sword had only just left it, no one told a priest. They merely looked and went on with their sweeping. There was work to do. It was winter and they had been given a name to call their courage by for a little while. A man had claimed it in a place that could hold 1,000 prayers and not grow heavier for them. That was enough. It had to be. It was